Good morning. It's the appointed time. We have a quorum. Let's invite representatives of the administration to come inside the conference room. I remind members that in accordance with Rule 83A of the Rules of Procedure, members should disclose the nature of any direct or indirect pecuniary interest relating to the item under discussion at the meeting before they speak on the item. If you wish to speak on policy matters relating to the bill, please press the Request to Speak button. Good morning, Secretary and the team. Mr. Frankie Yick. Thank you. I would like to follow up on the questions I asked earlier on the vehicle's age. There are concerns because right now, with a 7-year-old second-hand vehicle, it costs less than $100,000. So every day it would cost approximately $54. We have 60% of the vehicles that are still under loan. And I understand that every month the installment would be $15,000 to $25,000. So the cost per day is $500. So you can see the difference is great. It's approximately ninefold. And if you have seen recent media reports, when the representatives of taxi associations are asked, they said they would want to get the permits because they are easy to get and they will not be renting taxis. So that is going to exacerbate the situation because we already have a shortage of taxi drivers. Taxi drivers will switch to providing ride-hailing services. The issue is going to be more serious. And I think in the end it does not benefit society either because it is only with market competition that we can have more affordable prices. I can see with the commencement of the bill, it can be very difficult for the taxi trade to survive. So I want to ask for the age of vehicles, can you go back to 7 years or 5 years? Of course, we want to have it aligned with the requirements for taxi fleet, which is 3 years, but I guess it's not exactly possible. All right, Secretary. Thank you. On regulation of ride-hailing vehicles, we want to make sure that the vehicles are safe for citizens. So we take the age limit to be 12 years. And we talked about when one first obtains a permit for ride-hailing vehicles. When a private car gets to its 7th year, there will be inspections made. We want to make sure that there is a proper entry threshold for ride-hailing vehicles. We want to make sure there is a certain quantity and supply of ride-hailing vehicles to make sure it is easy for people to order a ride-hailing vehicle. And we continue with the threshold of 12 years. It offers some flexibility. As for what Mr. Frankie Yick said about the operations of a taxi trade, With this framework for ride-hailing services, I believe it will improve the situation. It will make it easier for the taxi trade, as a matter of fact, because it promotes healthy competition. We have conducted some surveys beforehand, and we understand for most of the vehicles providing ride-hailing services at the moment, they have an age of 10 odd years. If by imposing this threshold of 12 years for age of vehicles, it is quite stringent. There should be less vehicles that can provide ride-hailing services. Some in the trade are concerned that with a framework for ride-hailing service vehicles, it may discourage new blood to join the taxi trade. I would say this: we have already set some qualification requirements for drivers of ride-hailing vehicles. Certain conditions would have to be met. I think there will definitely be an improvement in the situation for the taxi trade. The Transport Department will continue to liaise with the taxi trade to see how we can further promote development of the taxi trade. Thank you. Dr. Chen Hanpan. Thank you, Chair. I do understand that ride-hailing platforms have to retain their operational data in Hong Kong. But in Hong Kong, unlike the mainland, we do not have data security laws prohibiting the exporting of such data. We do not have the relevant laws or regulations. How can we request that companies do not export their operational data? Next, as I said earlier, there are some rules in the mainland on exporting of data. If the platform concerned was originally a mainland platform and they will have users who have accounts set up in the mainland, if the users are using the platform in Hong Kong, and if we request information from the platform for us to know who the user is, for example, or other information, would it be the case that due to information security laws in the mainland or other places, we will not be able to find out some information about the user? In the principal ordinance, should we have some provisions on data security in response to this? Thank you, Secretary. We do attach great importance to information security for ride-hailing platforms because they have to take orders and communicate with users. They will have to process a large amount of data. We do have some provisions that cover this in the bill. We have asked platforms to store, supply relevant data when necessary. And in future, the commissioner, when drawing up the license conditions, the platforms will be asked to provide data when requested by the commissioner. On data security, the ride-hailing platforms are providing public transport services in future. The commissioner regulates public transport services. So the Transport Department will be regulating the operations of the platforms in future. They need to the commissioner will need to make sure certain service standards are met, and the determination will be made on the basis of operational data provided by the platforms. The platforms are also incorporated in Hong Kong. We also ask the platforms to have local staff. This is an entry threshold. The data may be stored in servers in the mainland or other places. Indeed, and it may be the case that the data may not be stored locally. There may indeed be, as the member said, other legislation in other jurisdictions that may regulate the use of such data. But we ask the platforms to comply with our requirements and law. Even though there may be other legislation in other jurisdictions that regulate the platforms, it is only when our requirements are met that we will issue licenses to the platforms. We will conduct more research, and we will also liaise with platforms. We will also refer to the experiences in other jurisdictions and specify the regulations in future. Mr. Chen Siu-hong. Thank you, Chair. With this bill, we will be able to regulate ride-hailing service. I believe the policy intent is that we will be regulating ride-hailing services with the amended legislation. We already have a principal ordinance, Chapter 374, Road Traffic Ordinance. We are also regulating with this law taxi and taxi fleet services. The ride-hailing platforms should be able to provide taxi and taxi fleet services on top of ride-hailing services. And I do note in the bill other types of services are covered. So when you amend the ordinance for ride-hailing platforms that are providing taxi or taxi fleet services to users, should there be irregularities or contraventions in law for Chapter 374 or 374D, Regulation 55, which law will you prosecute the platforms on? Of course, we can talk about this in detail when we get to clause-by-clause examination, but I want to know what the general principle is when different provisions are contravened, how this will be handled, so that there will not be the case that one is being prosecuted for multiple offenses in a single incident. Thank you. Secretary, we clearly define that ride-hailing services have two elements. One, ride-hailing platform service. Two, ride-hailing transport service. So, in general, we will have platforms taking orders, receiving orders from users who would like to request ride-hailing service. So basically, the platforms communicate with the users. And then we have the other component with the provision of public transport service. We will have private cars providing passenger transport services through ride-hailing platforms. And we will have ride-hailing vehicles that are private cars providing such services. Platforms would have some responsibilities. They have to conduct due diligence checks to make sure the vehicles meet the requirements, they also need to maintain a certain level of service standards. They will need to store relevant data. They will need to receive orders from the users and maintain communication with users. When the drivers under the ride-hailing platforms receive the orders, they will provide passenger transport services to the users. We believe the framework is quite comprehensive, and in future, as Mr. Chan Siu-hong mentioned, we may have the platforms providing taxi and taxi fleet services. They may also provide hired car services through the platforms. So this relationship will also apply to platforms that provide taxi and hired car services.
With regard to a requirement on the platforms and the fact that they will have to comply with relevant legislation, and whether or not there would also be criminal liability, and also in terms of the service standards, if they're not able to meet the standards, then of course there will also be follow-up measures available under the law, depending on the merits of the case. If it's about passenger carrying services, that is, if the driver commits traffic offense, then the relevant vehicle and also the driver is involved in certain offenses. For example, there is also this point score system, and also if they fail to take out proper insurance and so on, depending on the circumstances and whether or not it applies to the situation, then we would also take follow-up action accordingly. Thank you. Mr. Frankie Yik. The whole purpose is to ensure that there will be fair competition so that the quality of service will be enhanced, so that the passenger experience will be improved, and then they'll be able to get good service. But then in the course of doing that, we understand that in the taxi trade, there are a lot of restrictions. For example, they will have to install CCTV, and also the point score system that has been in place for taxi drivers and so on. So would that also apply to ride-hailing services, or else there wouldn't be any fair competition at all, because they don't have to comply with all these rules and regulations, and yet the taxi drivers will have to comply with all that. As Mr. Yik Chi Ming said, fewer and fewer drivers will be willing to drive. So would that apply to ride-hailing services drivers? And if not, why not? Bureau Director, thank you for Mr. Chan's question. With regard to the point-to-point service and also the drivers, whether it's the ride-hailing services in the future or existing taxi drivers and so on, we would apply the same kind of requirements on them. For example, they will have to be tested. They will also have to undergo body checks. They will also have to take out insurance. They will also have to take pre-service course. With regard to traffic offences, those would also apply to both kinds of drivers, as we have spelled out in the law. That is, if they apply to be drivers of ride-hailing services, if they apply for the permit during the previous 5 years, they must not have committed any traffic offence. With regard to taxi drivers, we have also introduced new requirements. We have this taxi driver offense point system. As you might recall, under this system, for more serious offenses that are very common in the taxi trade, those offenses which we would say that are overcharging and also making or taking detours and so on, when it's applied to ride-hailing services drivers, we have also thought about this, given the fact that there is a platform to come up with this agreed fees and also the determined route. So relatively speaking, the kind of overcharging and also making detours and so on should be reduced substantially, because you have this platform and there is already this prior agreement, and therefore these offences may not apply to ride-hailing services. But then for the three kind of guarantees, that is within the taxis, we have also passed this legislation, there would be statutory requirements for them to install car cams and also navigation services and so on. So in the provision of ride-hailing services, because they will have to make use of internet booking, so that the route would already be transmitted to the driver, and the driver would also have to know about the route that they are required to take, and therefore we would require that there would also be GPS on the car, and also car cams and so on. So that would also apply to ride-hailing services drivers. But then in the future, if we see a need for further enhancement, then of course, depending on the circumstances, we would also come up with relevant requirements under the law, and those would also be considered. Thank you. Ms. Doreen Kong. Thank you, Chairman. I have two questions, which I asked last time, but then because of time limit, the Bureau Director might not have been able to answer them. First is about business registration. According to Hong Kong's tax laws, for any kind of business for a profit, whatever way they are operating, whether or not it's operated online, they would still have to register. They would also have to have a business registration, and for those running taxi services, they would also be subject to this business registration requirement. And therefore, for ride-hailing services drivers, do they have to get a business registration? That's the first point. And secondly, I've also asked this last time, that is under the law, we have also said that for registration and also getting actual benefit of being the beneficial owner of that would be two different things, and therefore they could also do a trust for their taxis, or they might even have their license under a trust. So then they would also be able to evade the legislation. So in terms of the driver's permit, you said that that would not be permitted to be transferred to other people. So does that mean that the vehicle and also the driver's permit cannot be placed under a trust? And thirdly, well, I gradually thought about this. That is about critical infrastructure, because earlier on this council passed a piece of legislation, for the aggregate platforms, and of course those might not be taken to be critical infrastructure, but then for such a ride-hailing platforms, because of the scale of operation, would there be a chance? Well, I understand that you may not be able to answer that right away, but then is there a chance that they could also be defined as a critical infrastructure? Bureau Director. Well, three questions. Some are very specific and legalistic. So specifically, this is something new to us, and therefore we will be looking into that in detail. With regard to critical infrastructure, well, the considerations would also be taken on board. We hope that in introducing something new under this law, we would have to ensure that in every respect, in terms of our security, safety, and everything else, those would be in order. But then at the same time, we don't want to over-legislate. We don't want to over-regulate. And Ms. Kong also referred to two issues, as they also involve the interpretation of other pieces of legislation and also some existing circumstances, and therefore I'll have to defer to the Permanent Secretary to answer the questions. Well, thank you. Well, indeed, what Ms. Kong asked was rather in-depth. Is about the matter of principle and also some legal issues. Allow me to spend some more time, because that would also have something to do with an earlier question, because overall the legal principles are that for ride-hailing platforms, well, as the Bureau Director just said, ride-hailing services would involve two parts. One would be the platform, one would be the passenger carrying services. Well, for the booking service via the platforms, well, they would also have to show the responsibilities for both, but then they would be somewhat different, because as far as the platform is concerned, well, the ride-hailing service would involve the offer of placing orders, so that the drivers would be connected online. And then secondly is for the owner and also the driver, because after they have been linked, then the owner and the driver would be responsible for providing the passenger carrying services to the customer. So that's the second element. Well, the reason why I have to start from there, because the business registration in this regard, obviously, well, for ride-hailing services would be somewhat different from taxi services, because for ride-hailing services, there is no further requirement for them to be a taxi owner, because the ride-hailing services would already connect the driver with the customer, and therefore after the order has been placed, the owner would no longer be able to rent his car for a profit, and therefore the ride-hailing services permits should not be confused with taxi licenses. So when it comes to business registration, at present the traffic department does require that if you renew a taxi license, then you will have to have a business registration. But then for ride-hailing services, there is no such a requirement, and therefore for ride-hailing drivers, I think the idea is the same as taxi drivers. That is, as far as the transport department is concerned, there is no need for them to take out a business registration before they can become taxi drivers. But then Ms. Kong was right in the sense that, well, we do have many self-employed people in Hong Kong, and are they required to take up a business registration before they can operate the business? Well, we have not touched on that yet, because after all, business registration is under the ambit of another bureau, and therefore we do not intend to change that concept. With regard to registration and also beneficial owners and so on, well, we would take the vehicle as the principal asset to be registered, and therefore the driver's permit would not be permitted to be transferred. And even for a vehicle mortgage, well, very often the car owner and the registered person would also have to be covered, and very often we would not cover the person using the asset. So that principle would apply, and therefore whoever is the beneficiary owner would not be covered. Yes, well, overall speaking, for ride-hailing services, the vehicle license have to be kept. So my question for the bureau director is this. Well, I don't have those figures with me, but then for ride-hailing drivers, well, many of them are working on part-time basis, and therefore, let's say every week, they would be driving irregularly. Sometimes they would drive for longer hours, sometimes shorter. So they're working part-time, and then they might have another job, but then they might have quit another job after a while. So would there be a mechanism in place? For example, if there's been an extended period of time that they have not been online, let's say after 180 days, and after they have not been driving for a while, then would they be replaced as a result of that, so as to ensure that in terms of the operability, the number of drivers would remain the same or constant? And also for some trucks and vans, they could also be made available for ride-hailing services. I understand that some people would also use such services when they travel to the airport. So for such passenger vans, would those also be covered under the law on this occasion, so that they would also have to get a ride-hailing service permits before they can carry passengers? Or would there be any limitation so that they would not be allowed to take passengers, or else they would also have to apply for a license? So what will happen? Thank you for your questions, Mr. Ho. Well, for ride-hailing services, drivers, the ecology regulating their operation would be rather fluid, because as we can see, there would also be a diversification. Well, some people might not be working full-time, and they might be rather flexible in terms of the number of hours and the number of time that they would provide a service. So with the coming into place of this law, initially they might be more willing to put in more time to provide the service. I think that would also be rather fluid. Well, I remember last time Mr. Chen Hengpan also asked, that is, by the time when it comes into operation, would there be drivers who might not be connected online for a while, and therefore the whole situation might be frozen, and there might not be a lot of activities at all. So we have now come up with some rules for entry into this profession. Indeed, the threshold has been heightened, so that would also incur a cost. They will have to take out insurance. They would also have to undergo the tests. And then after going through those procedures, after they have well thought out whether or not they'd like to join the profession, then they join after all those procedures. So it's not like what is happening now, because it's rather random right now, and then whatever they like to do, they can just do it.
On another point, in future, it may be the case that in our regulations we may specify the minimum number of hours, or should we work with the platforms to see what administrative arrangements can be fleshed out? We believe the latter will be more flexible because we will be asking the platforms for their operational data anyway, and we have a general cap set. So for the platforms, with this cap, they want to make sure they have an adequate number of drivers providing relevant services. So in future, we will try to see how we can impose a cap on the vehicles rather than on the number of drivers, so that we can meet the demand of users for passenger transport services. I guess we have the same perspective. We want to improve user experience and provide more options to users. Thank you. Reverend Peter Kuhn. I want to ask about the permits to be obtained by ride-hailing vehicle drivers. I believe the requirements will be laxer than those for taxi drivers. Can we make them even laxer though? That's my question, because we do not have new blood joining the taxi trade, because it is hard for them to get in. If we make it easier for drivers to join the ride-hailing service trade, it will be easy. And if you have visited Japan, you could see that they could make use of technology showing the route for them, making it easy for the drivers. So I think we can make better use of advanced technology. We do have a shortage of drivers in the taxi trade already, and if we have relatively similar requirements for the taxi trade or the ride-hailing service, if one wants to join as a driver, even if they do not have a vehicle, they would want to become a taxi driver. I think we can have lesser requirements because passenger safety can be guaranteed with other things. So I think we can make the requirements lesser. Thank you. Secretary, Reverend Peter Kuhn, I very much agree with what you said. We want to streamline the requirements, improve user experience. This is our vision. I will ask the Commissioner for Transport to provide a specific response to Reverend Peter Kuhn on the procedures we're going to streamline in November, so that we can make it easier for people to take the taxi examinations that will also be valid for those who would want to obtain ride-hailing vehicle driving permits. Thank you. Commissioner, thank you. We have now streamlined taxi examination requirements announced, before we would focus on routes and locations knowledge. Drivers are providing public transport services, which is why we have more stringent requirements on safe use of roads. Many questions in the examination are on this. As the member said, with advancement in technology, we do not need drivers to be as well versed in routes to different locations. But then for road safety code, we will at least keep the number of questions at its current level to ensure passenger safety. We will have the streamlined examination arrangements for taxi drivers in November. We are preparing the new examination manual. We hope to make it more easy for those who would like to join the taxi or ride-hailing service trade, and we also want to facilitate them that with the taking of this examination alone, they can obtain both the taxi license and the ride-hailing driving permit in future. I have a follow-up, Chair. Can you simplify the arrangements further? Because sometimes people may want to drive different types of vehicles depending on their own circumstances. Of course, we would want to check their past records, and if they want to drive this type of vehicle, for example, we can provide a professional license first and make it easier for drivers to transition. Thank you, Commissioner. We do pay close attention to the situation. When we administer the examination, we do want to make sure the examination is fair. Thank you. I would like to supplement the Commissioner's answers. With the simplified examination arrangements promulgated in November, it would still require drivers to study for the examination. We may have a simplified question pool, but we still require some basic knowledge to be had, especially in location and route still. But as Reverend Peter Kuhn said, we can perhaps have some incentives for drivers to join in the pool for ride-hailing drivers. The Transport Department will try to make more space to shorten the waiting time for drivers to take examinations to help with that. Indeed, the new blood is not willing to join the industry because of various restrictions, and we do want to remove such restrictions. Thank you. Mr. Lai Tong-kwok. Thank you, Chair. I would like to follow up on what Ms. Doreen Kong said earlier. It is a case that with one conducting business, they should obtain business registration because they should be paying profits tax on profits derived from their business. Of course, charging taxes is not a responsibility of the Transport Department, but I think for the operations of the government, we can have better coordination. Let me give you an example. For one applying for a ride-hailing vehicle driving permit, since they're conducting business, you should ask them for proof of business registration. So they need to at least obtain business registration. They need to make declarations, or they have to fill in the tax return. They may not have to pay taxes in the end, but at least they have to fill in information for taxes. It's just like what other drivers do. So one may fill in tax return as an individual or as a business. We have this tax system in place. We do want to provide more opportunities for drivers to earn more, but the drivers in turn would have responsibilities to pay taxes. Thank you. Secretary, thank you, Mr. Leighton Kwok, for your questions and suggestions. The Permanent Secretary may want to supplement answers in due course. We do understand your concerns. There is a responsibility for drivers to pay taxes. With this framework that we have, we do not wish to change the current circumstances. Mr. Lai's understanding is quite correct. We, however, want to be prudent. For drivers or ride-hailing vehicle owners to conduct relevant business, they need to renew their licenses. The licenses are not permanent. And as Mr. Chen Xiu-hong asked earlier, and I answered his questions, I pointed out that the nature of this service is quite unique. We have to carefully consider different factors to make sure we are not making changes to our tax system in any way. We also want to make sure that under our policy portfolio, there will not be clashes. So we will carefully consider Mr. Lai's comments after the meeting. But let me say this, platforms are companies incorporated in Hong Kong. They already have a business registration. They are paying taxes themselves. Before, we had concerns where the platforms are serving Hong Kong citizens without paying taxes on the profits they derive. We have already eliminated this problem with this framework. Permanent Secretary, thank you. We are trying to differentiate ride-hailing services with taxi services. Under the requirements of the Transport Department, taxi permit owners are required to submit proof of business registration, and they also need to produce proof of business registration when they are transferring the licenses. With the ride-hailing service vehicles, we consider it unnecessary to impose such requirements. But we do note what Mr. Lai said. Drivers are self-employed. They should pay taxes on the income they earned. We will see what we can do, whether we should require them to produce proof of business registration or otherwise. We want to make things simple, though. Thank you. Mr. Sunny Tan, thank you, Chair. I do agree that the Bureau should try to practice a more flexible approach. I have two questions. Can a driver or a vehicle owner register on more than one platform so that there may be double counting of the number of drivers, causing an overestimation on the number of vehicles in the market? Mr. Adrian Ho also talked about the fact that there are most likely going to be drivers driving on a part-time basis. If we can have drivers and vehicles available during peak hours. And if we have more of that during peak hours, that is definitely appreciated. How can we make sure more of such vehicles that will be available during peak hours will be able to get the permits rather than just those who are driving on a part-time basis? What are the government's plans in this regard? How can we expedite the application process? Also, that's my second question. How can we regulate the operations effectively to make sure there is a certain number of vehicles available every day? The second question is on the paying of taxes. We do have platforms having relevant data, so can the platform submit to the administration business of the drivers? Thank you.
Bureau Director, thank you for your questions, Mr. Chen. I think I can also elaborate on a couple of points. First, ride-hailing services drivers, when they provide such service, well, as far as Hong Kong is concerned right now, we have no legal platforms for them to do so. But then in other places, these services have been quite mature. So the idea is that we have a share economy so that we would be releasing or unleashing the idle capacity so that they can make use of the location where their vehicles are placed and where time is right. Then they can also complement the current services. For example, if it's during peak hours or during late night hours or in the ungodly hours, then they would be able to provide a service. Other than that, the service standards, for example, if there are certain requirements for specific services, then ride-hailing services would be able to fill in the gaps. And therefore, for qualified drivers providing ride-hailing services, we have no requirement that they would have to belong or serve under a certain platform, because we want to attract more people to join the profession so that after they've been tested, after they've got the driver's permit to provide a service, then through these platforms they could be recruited so that different drivers can be serving on different platforms. I think there are merits to this, because at the same time we can also prevent a certain platform from monopolizing the service, and then they can also share the profit with the platform. And also in terms of the relationship between the drivers and the platform, that might also affect the rights and interests of certain drivers, and therefore in deciding on the overall capacity limit or the cap of the number of drivers and so on, we would also have to consider the ecology of point-to-point service and also the public services capacity and so on. And therefore, I agree that starting from November, we can streamline the written tests for taxi drivers, and after they have taken the test, taxi drivers can also be qualified for providing ride-hailing services, because we'd like to attract as many people as possible to join the profession. But of course, at the same time, we will also have to be careful as to how this can operate. So we will have to ensure that we will have a sufficiently large pool of drivers so that when such services are available, we will also have to be very careful in designing for a transitional mechanism and also how they enter the profession and so on. So in coming up with the subsidiary legislation and also how the licenses would be issued, well, at the same time, we will have to ensure that there would be both regulation and flexibility. And also on the business registration for ride-hailing services platforms, I think that would also mean that Hong Kong's taxation principles would apply, and therefore we will require both the platforms and the drivers to be regulated. We will be discussing this with the relevant department, and in the next stage of development, we will have to make sure that that will be done properly, and we might just invoke the existing legislation to clearly explain the situation. So we'll be disclosing the details in due course. Mr. Gary Zhang, thank you. At present, there is no regulation for such ride-hailing services. So we have private cars and and also individual drivers providing the service. There is no regulation whatsoever. But then when the law comes into effect, then the ecology will change because they will become public services, and these drivers will be providing ride-hailing services under the law. So they would be working like taxi drivers. So I'd like to ask a matter of concept or principle. When such ride-hailing services are available, so at the same time, we have public transport vehicles. We also have private cars providing the service. They will at the same time have to meet the same set of legal requirements. So how do we distinguish between the two? For example, the driver, well, for commercial drivers, in terms of their age and so on, well, the requirement would be somewhat different from a private individual driver. So for drivers for ride-hailing services, how do we define them? And also for certain hardware of the vehicles, well, the requirements on private cars will be somewhat different from taxis and also public transport vehicles and so on. So for ride-hailing vehicles, how do we define that? So would they be subject to the requirements of the private cars or public transport vehicles? So can you elaborate a bit on that? Well, if we attach too much, if we rely too much on principles, then there might be some problems. Well, I can give you an example. Well, in principle, is a private car, but then if they are providing passenger carrying services through the ride-hailing service platforms, then they would immediately be considered a public transport vehicle, and they are providing public transport service. So that is the idea. So the mindset is that the overriding principle is to protect the safety of passengers. So the nature is that it's a private car on its own, but then in providing the ride-hailing services, is providing a public transport service, and therefore, in terms of protecting the passengers' safety and security, the same principles would apply. For example, on the issue of body check, we often say that, well, for commercial drivers, they would also be subject to certain body condition requirements, but then there is no similar term to that. But then I recall reading some literature. So there is no such a specific term of commercial drivers. So we would be looking at their driver's license, and then we would give them a different serial number. For example, if they're driving taxis, driving a public minibus or whatever, so they will be given a different serial number to denote that. So for minibus, light trucks, light vans, and also medium-sized goods vehicles and so on. So the requirements for driving those would be somewhat more stringent than a private car driver. And therefore, for drivers of ride-hailing services, because they are providing a public transport service, and therefore they would be treated as an equivalent to the types of commercial vehicles that one would be permitted to drive. So those would be consistently applied. And on the other hand, as I've answered another member's question earlier, so to install certain devices on board of the car, and also the point system for taxi drivers, well, if they are not managed or supervised by a particular car fleet, then we would look at the nature of the public service. They will also be subject to certain regulation, and there are already technical devices available to regulate or monitor their services. So there is no need for us to distinguish between taxis and other ride-hailing services and apply different or the same rules, but then we will be flexible. So we will be looking at the requirements. We will be dynamically looking at what is suitable to suit the nature of the service, and also to ensure the safety of the passengers when they go out. Yes, Mr. Luk Chung Hong. Thank you, Chairman. with regard to the regulation of ride-hailing services, the core of this piece of legislation is to control the number. We have discussed that several times. But then, with regard to the number of such vehicles, the administration told us that they would be regulating the number. There would be a cap on the number of such vehicles. But then, is there a scientific way of calculation? Because I understand that the service is very flexible, because some drivers would be working full-time, they would be working very long hours, others would be working part-time, and then they would just be driving for a couple of hours a week. So how do we assess whether or not the number is adequate? And the market would also be expecting that there would be regular reviews on the number, and also there would also be certain regulation on how they operate. So there would be a scientific mechanism available, because whether or not it's over or under, there would still be controversy. So I hope that something can be done about it in order to ensure that there would be social stability, because whenever there is a dispute, there would be people jumping out to express very strong views. So in the future, can we come up with a more scientific mechanism to determine the right number of such vehicles on the roads? And also, it's also a question of supply and demand. So if you regulate the number of vehicles, and if the number is smaller than the number of applications, then do they have to draw ballots, draw lots to determine who would get the priority? And then some people might decide to become commercial drivers. But then how are you going to ensure that there would not be people who just apply for the permits, and yet they would not be providing any service, and therefore they would just be dormant permit holders? So you might think that, well, after you have got the permit, if you don't use it, then it's at your own loss. But then would you be providing for the number of hours or minimum hours that they would have to provide the service before they would be eligible for renewing the permit next time? Yes, we'll be looking into that at the next stage. But then to respond to the several points made by Mr. Lok, they are very good. So in the next stage of our review, we would strike a balance, and we would be looking into those very carefully. Now, let's focus on our bill. We hope that the bill will give us the flexibility and the proper arrangements. The idea is that under the law, we have already provided that the commissioner would have the power to decide on the cap of such vehicles in providing the services. That would also be a realization of our intention, because we are not suggesting there should be an unlimited number of vehicles providing the service, because in Hong Kong's case, well, the concept is that we will have to limit the number of vehicles providing the service. That would be somewhat different from other places. So that's the first point. And secondly, we will have to take citizens' interests as our first and foremost consideration. So their safety and their convenience would be what we have in mind. And therefore, how do we make sure that, well, for some irregular service requirements, they will still be met? And also the mode of operation would be somewhat different from the taxi service. And therefore, we will have to be more dynamic and more flexible in considering this. And therefore, in the bill, we have got some provisions here so that the commissioner would be able to look at the needs, and then he or she can come up with an appropriate way to make sure that the permits for ride-hailing services can be distributed accordingly. So as a matter of principle, that's the design of the mechanism that would give us sufficient room and flexibility, so that in the next stage, after we have reviewed the situation carefully, then we will come up with an appropriate arrangement. We believe that we'll be able to take on board different views from this council as well as the community, so that through some labor unions and groups, we can reach out to more drivers, and then we'll be able to understand how they operate more. That would also help us in our upcoming review. Thank you.
Mr. Martin Liao. Thank you. Chair, I want to follow up on what Reverend Peter Kuhn asked about taxi written test. One of the policy intents is to attract new blood to join the service trade. I talked to the secretary earlier, and apparently the test was quite simple. If the test is so simple, why do we even require people to take the test? What I'm concerned about is if you set too many restrictions, in the end we will not have anyone trying to provide such services. I think it's good that we will be referring to the practices in other jurisdictions. The commissioner said earlier the test will be testing knowledge on road and passenger safety and location and routes. On the questions in relation to safety, I actually disagree with what the commissioner said. As any road user, we should hold them to the same standards in safety. We should not be imposing additional safety requirements on taxi drivers or ride-hailing services vehicle drivers. I consider the requirements to be unreasonable. Reverend Peter Kuhn said earlier also, perhaps we could streamline the arrangements further. We can probably just ask drivers to take a course online. On location and routes, right now the written test requires drivers to be knowledgeable about routes to different locations, but with GPS navigation now, this is probably no longer necessary, or at least we don't require drivers to be as knowledgeable. Again, my concern is if we have too many restrictions, in the end, no one would want to provide such services. It goes against our intention to have more drivers joining the trade. Thank you. Secretary, we want to make sure there is proper assessment to meet our standards for safe commute services provided to citizens. We also do, as the member said, want to attract more new blood to join the trade. We will see how we can achieve this vision with reference to Mr. Liao's comments in future. We have made some drastic changes in the test requirements. I guess that is what we'll do for now. In future, we will consider more options. Indeed, with advancements of technology, there is really no need to ask the taxi drivers or drivers in general so many questions on location and routes. This is somewhat outdated, but then we still need to have some questions on location and routes because sometimes navigation may not be so accurate. And right now, we would have some taxis that do not even have GPS navigation, whereas ride-hailing vehicles should have that. We will also have pre-service training courses provided to taxi drivers on manners and how they are to serve passengers. We have already streamlined the relevant questions. In future, we will consider whether we can give the test online, but I guess we should first focus on streamlining the specific test questions first. Thank you, Mr. Champulan. Thank you, Chair. Many members have expressed concern. I do understand where the different members are coming from. Now, on my observations, I think we've been focusing on how we are going to set a cap on the total number of permits to be issued. But then I think in future, more likely than not, we will have quite a number of people wanting to apply for such permits. So how can we select those who will get the permits? Is it by drawing lots? But with the drawing of lots, there's bound to be dissatisfaction. And we also need to make sure the cap set will not affect traffic conditions. The Commissioner for Transport has the power to set the cap in future for the number of ride-hailing vehicles. If we set through platforms a designated number of vehicles that can travel on roads during specific hours, I believe we can achieve the same function if we can control the number of orders on platforms. We should be able to achieve this. And it will also prevent the problems of those having applied for permits but not actually driving the vehicles providing ride-hailing services. So if we can impose controls through platforms, you can effectively control how many vehicles are traveling on roads, and while making sure there is an adequate number of vehicles on the roads to provide ride-hailing services. Would you consider my suggestion? Thank you. Secretary, thank you, Mr. Chen, for your questions and comments. We do appreciate the suggestions given by members, providing us with more possible options. We will set the cap in the next phase. I guess we can focus on what we're promulgating in our framework at the moment. We have set in the provisions powers of the Commissioner to make allocations. We will provide the details in future in regulations. We are thinking to impose a cap on the number of vehicles, and the permits will expire at some point. We do not expect bidding to be used in the issuance of permits because it may cause speculation of such permits or second-hand trading of the permits. We do not want this to become a commodity for speculation. We want to make sure permit holders can provide a certain level of quality of services. We will see in future what arrangements are appropriate for the issuance of permits. As for platforms, in their operation, what their scale should be or how many vehicles they should make available. Whether we should impose a minimum number of vehicles to be made available during certain hours, becoming a licensing condition. This is something we'll explore in future. If a platform does not have a critical mass to have a certain number of drivers or vehicles available during certain hours, it will impact their service quality. So I guess with the cap or the minimum number of vehicles and drivers available, we will determine that in due course. Thank you, Mr. Frankie Yik. Thank you, Chair. Secretary, I would first like to follow up on several questions asked by other members. I do understand you said that there is a sharing economy and that there are ride-hailing vehicles that play an important role in the sharing economy. And in Singapore, I understand when one enters the CBD, there will be specific charges charged to the vehicle, and in turn, some of it will be transferred on to users. I want to ask if something similar will be implemented in Hong Kong. I also want to talk about the point made by another member on whether requirements should align for taxi drivers and ride-hailing vehicle drivers. I would say this: for taxis, we already dealt with the relevant functions for e-payment and dash cams, but we still have some reservations about dash cams because we have some privacy concerns. But this will actually provide protection for not only passengers but also drivers. So should we have CCTV cameras installed for ride-hailing vehicles as well? As for the driving permits, the Secretary said we should not have bidding for the permits. I do not understand the justifications provided by the Secretary. Since the vehicles are tied to the drivers, there can really not be any speculation unless you have one selling their vehicles. But then the drivers or the vehicle owners would have to apply for a permit again, I believe, so there won't be a secondary market. I don't quite understand what the Secretary said. Thank you. Secretary, with the regulatory framework for ride-hailing services in Hong Kong, we will be regulating the ride-hailing platforms and the vehicles and drivers. The principle is we will have vehicle owners of private cars to provide services with their vehicles in their downtime. This is releasing idle capacity and productivity, so one can drive their vehicles to provide services, passenger transport services in their downtime. Mr. Yik talked about sharing economy. I'm not sure if the member is concerned about having multiple passengers conveyed by a single vehicle, but let me say this is not allowed. With what Mr. Frankie Yik said about having cameras installed and e-payment method available on taxis. For ride-hailing service vehicles, these requirements are not necessary because the bookings must be made through the ride-hailing platforms and the payment would already be electronic in the first place. As bookings will be made on electronic platforms, one will have their phones or other electronic devices showing the destination of the booking, and that will already provide GPS navigation. We have some private cars that already have dash cams installed, because that would facilitate insurance claiming. As for in-car cameras, we should be more prudent with this, because in other times, private cars will just be conveying their own family members. It is only when they are providing ride-hailing services that they will have passengers. And with fleet management, we have platforms gauging user feedback to ensure quality of services provided, and the platforms must deal with complaints of passengers. This is a license condition of a fleet license, so we should perhaps tackle the root cause of a problem rather than having in-car cameras installed. We can explore the different options, but I also talked to some members. I understand there are some very advanced technologies with in-car cameras being turned on only at certain times. I guess we can explore this in future. Thank you.
Mr. Chen Hock-Fong. Thank you, Chairman. Well, to follow on what Mr. Chen Pui-Leung just asked, all along I support the narrative of Mr. Chen Pui-Leung. We should just regulate the platform instead of the number of vehicles in service. Well, why do I say that? Because, well, as we have been taking private cars, because, well, for the present ride-hailing services, most of those vehicles are servicing this would be private cars, and the private cars would also have to have their permit renewed. And therefore, if there are 5,000 cars are replacing their vehicle permit, then there would be immediately 5,000 vehicles less running on the streets. And therefore, if you try to regulate the number of vehicles, that would be rather confusing. So if you make sure that, whichever vehicle is to provide a service, it will have to be registered, and therefore, if you regulate the platform, then you can ensure that at any one time you will have a certain number of vehicles running on the roads, because that would also help resolve the problem of having fewer and fewer vehicles providing the service in 5 years' time. So I think Mr. Chen Pui-Leung has a very similar view to that of the DAB. That is the best way to solve the problem of insufficient number of vehicles providing the service. So in the long run, I hope that the Bureau Director will consider this. Thank you. Well, in coming up with this regulatory regime, what we hope to do is that within the sector, will be able to have a situation whereby they would complement one another. And another point that we are concerned about is to ensure that there would be sufficient number of vehicles providing the service. That's the reason why we have introduced this mechanism. Another important factor is that when it comes to the vehicles permits and also the number of permits to be issued, indeed, we have already set out that the longest period of renewal would be for 5 years. So that would also ensure that it's not forever. And that would also give us more flexibility and space to maneuver, so that the platform might just want to try it out for 1 or 2 years. And then in appropriate time, we can also introduce other new players. And then if you look at the number of permits to be issued, well, every year we will have to look at the car examination records and also the track record of that vehicle, and if the owner can be given a permit for providing ride-hailing services. And in the course of that, if they replace their cars, that would also be permitted, so that we would also ensure that the number of such vehicles will not be affected as a result of owners replacing their cars for various reasons. What we are concerned about is that will the number gradually drop, or will the service levels be inadequate? So from what we have heard from you, you'd all like us to make sure that when this comes into effect, the number will not drop or change beyond our control, whether or not it's going to become zombie permits and so on. So we have to ensure that there'll be convenience for people to travel and safety for the passengers, and the number would also have to remain steady. But then the capacity will not be affected by various factors. We will have to strike a balance, and therefore we will have to be very careful in designing the regime. Yes, Mr. Peter Kun, or Reverend Peter Kun. Yes, there are two types of people. One would be providing the ride-hailing services. One would treat it as a job, and therefore they might be driving 6 hours, 8 hours a day. So they would be running the service as a professional. Others would just be working part-time. What we are concerned about is that for those who are providing the service, will they all of a sudden be denied the license or permit? And therefore, at present, basically it's lawful to run the service, but then there are still some hidden concerns. I've also discussed with some drivers. They also share that anxiety. So can we distinguish between the two types of permits or licenses? Because the administration would require them to display in a conspicuous location the identification marks. If they are working full-time, then of course they will have to display it in a very conspicuous location. For example, they will also have to show that they are under this identification mark of A, B, and so on. So they will also have to display the name of the platform that they are serving. Others would not be required to do the same. So you will have to distinguish between the two. For those who are working as a professional, then you will have to ensure that their car fleet would be given the permit, or else some people might be using or working very actively, others not. But then they would not be like private cars, and therefore their identification would be somewhat different. The reason why they are not allowed to drive a taxi, that's because people might want to get a more luxurious 7-car van, and then some people have specifically purchased such vans in order to run this service or business. And if they're willing to invest in such vehicles, we should give them the opportunity to do this. The most important thing is after they've got the permit, they will have to run the service. What we are concerned about is that they might get the permit and yet they might not be providing the service. So there should be strict requirement for them to display that on their cars. So will that be considered by the administration, so that we would be able to at least solve a problem? That is for people who get the permits, they will have to run the service, and the license should not be confused with others who just get the permit without running the service. Thank you for your reminder, Reverend Kun. When we sort out the details, we can consider that further. But then let me give you my immediate response personally. Yes, we'd all like to think about how we can ensure that there would be sufficient capacity to provide the service. And in the long run, we will also have to collect the data as to how these operators run their service. I think the mentality is very similar to what Reverend Kun just said. But then that would also involve two issues that are rather sensitive, and we will have to be more careful about that. That is, you have to bear in mind that in terms of the number of hours of service, you will have to distinguish this. That is whether or not they just get a permit without really seriously thinking about running the service. So under the framework, you will also have to come up with more complicated details before you can work out that. And also, for drivers providing ride-hailing services, inevitably there would be two categories of people that would be created under what you propose. And right now, we have already got a pool of talents. They are taxi drivers. They are already running the service. Whatever the intention might be. In regulating the trade, we will have to make sure that we will not be affecting the existing mode of operation. The fact that the administration is willing to take this first step, what we'd like to achieve is that we will have to make sure that there would be steady service. We will have to streamline the mechanism as far as possible because we don't want to overregulate. So that's the mindset. And when we discuss that internally, we can also further review the situation in the sense that if we were to go down that track, then we will have to allow for more free rides. That is, we will have to look at the actual data, how many people actually apply for the permits, and we will review the situation. If most of them are just working part-time, not many of them would be working full-time, then if we find out that there is a certain number of people who are willing to take it as their full-time jobs, then we can then come up with a more detailed regulatory regime and the conditions to be set out in the license, because we don't want to be over stringent or overly complicated. So we will have to be very careful in striking a balance. I hope I have answered your question, because we want to be very careful in dealing with this. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chen Siu-Hong. Chairman, I'd like to ask the Bureau Director is about the Cross Harbour Tunnel or the Tai Lam Tunnel issue. I think I've asked that on previous occasions, and on different occasions when I talked to the Bureau Director, she indicated that even after introducing this ride-hailing services, for a ride-hailing car carrying passengers for a fee, and if they cross the tunnel or if they use the Cross Harbour Tunnel at different times, where the fees would be somewhat different when compared to taxis or other fee charging vehicles. The Bureau Director said that she'd like to maintain this consistency so that there would not be a very complicated charging regime. So if a private car is providing ride-hailing service, then you should adopt this across the board fee charging mechanism for raw vehicles. But then the Bureau Director would still like to maintain this differential fees, because it's hard to tell whether or not a private car is providing a service or whether or not is being used for private purposes. So when the private car is providing ride-hailing services, then would it be charged as other commercial vehicles? Thank you for your question. Well, in regulating ride-hailing services, it might appear to be very simple, and yet the actual mechanism is rather complicated, because in dealing with the fee charging mechanism for Tai Lam Tunnel and also the Cross Harbour Tunnels and so on, well, we have repeatedly discussed this before we reach the consensus or conclusion as to how that should work out. So we hope that by the time when we roll this out, we will try to make sure that things will not be changed dramatically to the extent that it would bring upheavals to the sector, because private cars providing a public transport service will have to be treated on a par with other commercial vehicles. So what we'd like to achieve is that we can strike a balance so that we can provide this in a steady manner. And then where there are voices in the community, we will be prepared to listen so that we can fine-tune the mechanism without affecting the overall situation. That's what I'd like to achieve. And of course, after the meeting, I can also discuss with Mr. Chen, because we have also talked about the fee charging mechanism for tunnels and so on. You're very professional, and therefore we will have to sort that out very carefully. But then as far as the present is concerned, I hope that as little change as possible. Okay, we're concerned that for the Thailand Tunnel and also the cross-harbor tunnels, whatever consensus that we have achieved with the new legislation, then there might be changes, because at that time we still hadn't got the ride-hailing services regulatory regime, and therefore by the time when we roll this out. So in terms of competitiveness between ride-hailing vehicles and other commercial vehicles, and also in terms of the capacity as a means of public transport, and also during peak hours, whether or not ride-hailing services would be complementing the existing public transport mechanism or transport system and so on. Those are very complicated issues, and therefore we will have to think about this very carefully so that as little change as possible should be the overriding principle. And you also talk about the total number of permits to be issued and also the enforcement details and so on. I think you will have to talk to different stakeholders to ensure that in the end you would just be catching the major you would just be dealing with the major problems, and then you would just let go the minor problems, and then you will also have to engage the stakeholders. I think this is good. Thank you.
comment.
All right, it's a comment. I guess the secretary would agree. Mr. Frankie Yick. Thank you, Chair. I want to follow up on the question I asked earlier on the age of vehicles. So, as the secretary said, she had information on the vehicles in service. There are some that exceed 12 years. I'm not sure how you obtain such data. 99% of the vehicles in service right now are illegal. If you say such data come from platforms, I have reservations because platforms are advocating for no cap to be set. So they have some vested interests. I also note the administration said with this regulatory framework, it will improve the situation for the taxi trade. Now, the trade is quite concerned because in future, when this is legalized, there will potentially be more people joining the trade because they think that the trade is not illegal, unlike right now, which has driven some people away. We had earlier Dr. Chen Hanpan and Mr. Lu Chonghong ask about the mechanism for the issuance of permits in relation to ride-hailing vehicles and drivers in future. And the administration said they would have regard to the actual circumstances. But the problem is the administration has no way of properly obtaining relevant data because the data would come from platforms. They may be skewed. I think right now you can already obtain such information without going through platforms. You can see how many vehicles are on the platforms. You can see how many people are subscribing the services. You can already gauge the utilization rate of such services. And if you are saying that if we reach a certain level of utilization, say 80 to 90%, then you will need to issue permits. But if you see the utilization rate is just 50%, but there are citizens saying that it takes longer than before to call a vehicle, would that already justify the administration in issuing more permits? I think there has to be a very scientific mechanism for the issuance of permits. And as some members said, we have some people who may apply for such permits just in case. But we have 40,000 odd and 50,000 people already. that are driving regularly, and we have some driving tutors who have got the permits, but they are not actually teaching people driving. They obtain the permits just in case. So I think we need to make sure there are in the platform's operations a mechanism to make sure the drivers are operating the vehicles. Thank you. Secretary, thank you. On the age of vehicles, I guess we do not need to go into detailed discussions on these points right now because in July we already talked about the age of vehicle being a requirement because we already have a validity period for permits, which is why we want to impose restrictions on the age of vehicles. We have seen other jurisdictions having the same approach. They have imposed a threshold on the age of vehicles, 10 or 13 years. Well, Mr. Frankie has already indicated he wanted to speak for another round. You may continue, Secretary. Sure. Alright, so when they apply for a permit, the driver will then be available for allocation. With the number of years of the age of vehicles being increased from 7 to 12, it does not affect the mechanism where we will still impose a 5-year validity period for permits. We just want to have more vehicles potentially available for the providing of ride-hailing services. It's all about striking a balance. I would like to reassure Mr. Frankie Yik and the taxi trade here. We want to have ride-hailing services complement taxi services, and both services can coexist. We believe that. As for how services or the vehicles and drivers are to be allocated, we will make sure we will go from the perspective of regulating platforms, but we have to remain dynamic. We should not be set on a cap. We want to make sure there is good user experience, and this is only pragmatic for us because this reflects truly what the situation is. So whether we will have a specific model, this is just a method of implementation. Right now we're discussing a regulatory framework that would give us room to achieve our vision. Thank you. Mr. Frankie. Thank you, Chair. How many permits are to be issued? Whether there should be a mechanism. We can discuss this when we are discussing the regulations. On the safety issue, actually the trade has some concerns. When you said the threshold is, or the limit is 7 years, then the private cars would have to undergo inspections when the cars are 6 years old. But I'm not sure if you would rather have annual inspections done. I think most of the drivers are going to drive full time. So, regardless of the age of vehicles, for ride-hailing service vehicles, since they are providing passenger transport services, should you go with the requirements for commercial vehicles and have annual inspections done rather than having inspections done at a certain point? Thank you. Secretary, for the issuance of permits, we do have a requirement for annual inspections to be done once the private cars reach 7 years old. Even though permits can be renewed between 7 and 12 years old, the vehicle must undergo annual inspection, and the commissioner will regulate such, making sure the vehicles meet such requirements. Perhaps the permanent secretary or commissioner can supplement my answers on this. Commissioner, thank you. We can have permits renewed for a year to 5 years, and if the vehicles are supposed to undergo annual inspections, this will be a requirement that has to be met before a permit is renewed. Thank you. I have a follow-up question. So you will probably invite tenders for the platforms, but will the licensees have to pay fees? I do not see this right now in the regulatory framework. Do you have in mind that you will charge license fees? Secretary, thank you, Chair. We do have a provision on license fees, so we will be charging license fees. Perhaps the permanent secretary can supplement my answers. Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, member, for the questions. We are regulating the platforms, drivers, and vehicle owners that are the drivers. There will be fees charged for the issuance of permits and licenses. The intent is quite clear. We are trying to recover the costs for issuing permits and licenses. We may charge more for platforms because they are profiting from the business. As for vehicle owners and drivers, we'll charge fees on a cost recovery basis. That's what we have in mind right now. We will explore the different options and provide more details in the next phase. Thank you. Well, I understand that the platforms charge 25 to 30% in commission at the moment, so they do make quite a profit. So I think if you're just trying to recover costs, it may not be proportionate to the profit that they are making. I understand what Mr. Frankie said. So for platforms, we can potentially charge more than what we can recover in costs. Thank you. We will have the Chief Executive's Q&A session soon, so we will perhaps stop here. We will resume. We'll have another session at 2:30 p.m. in conference room 1. Thank you for attending this meeting. Meeting adjourned.